The best way to get better at programming is to practice. And in this example, we want to practice using a function that's going to return a value. Specifically, we're going to take a look at the function that we just created, which printed out the area of a circle, but this time, instead of printing it, we want to return it to our calling function. How are we going to use that? Well, let's take a look. As always, you can find this file for download in the link provided below in the description. You can pause this video and attempt it on your own, and then resume the video to check your answer, or in case you get stuck, look at some hints on how to solve it. As before, we're going to have a function that we're defining as area of circle, and we're going to have a parameter called radius. And we'll go ahead and give it a default value just like we had before. I'm going to create a variable called area, and I'm going to say it equals pi, which is 3.14, times radius squared. So I can say radius times radius. I could also say radius star star 2. Those 2 stars is like raising something to an exponent. Now, this is just calculated my area, and it's stored it inside of a variable. If I want to use that variable, then I'm going to say return area. And the return is a built-in keyword to Python, and in other languages too, that is going to return a value to the calling function. So as soon as we hit return, we exit out of our function. If we put anything after it, it's completely ignored. Return exits our function, and it sends a value back to the calling function. So what's our calling function? Well, that's going to be our main function, just like we had before. And the key thing to remember when we call a function that returns a value is that we need to have a variable or some other method to use that value. So I'm going to say A1 equals area of circle. I'm going to pass in 1. A2 equals area of circle, and we're going to leave it blank. Now I can say print A1 and I can copy and paste this and then just change the appropriate values. I, of course, want to go a little bit further and use my proper form, so I'm going to say if. The more you do this, the faster it is to run. And so I'm going to go ahead and run this program, and you can see our answer there. Now, if you remember from our previous example, the area for the default was just slightly different. And what does that mean? Well, remember, this is a floating point value, and floating point numbers can occasionally have rounding errors. That's all this is. So I could use maybe a rounding function or maybe a print format command in order to change this. There's lots of things I could do to get the answer that I'm kind of more along the lines of expecting, but this is close enough. So that's the key thing to remember when we use a floating point value. It is an approximation. This is close enough, and that's what we care about. That's a couple of good things to remember. Now, a couple other things I just want to show you real quick when we use a function that returns a value. So, for example, here, instead of saying A2, comma, this is the area of a circle with the default radius, I'm going to go in here and simply, so what's going to happen is anything that is an argument inside of a function call, if it itself is a function, we're going to call that function first, and then we're going to call the outside function, in this case, print. So let me clear the screen from a terminal window, run it again, and you see the exact same thing happen. since it didn't get used, I'm going to come over here and simply delete A2. I'm going to say area of circle, but notice I am not storing what's returned into a variable. Well, what's going to happen? Well, if I go and run this, you'll notice that nothing changes between the two outputs. And you can kind of look at those line by line. Nothing's changed. So if I call a function that returns a value and I don't do anything with it, I don't put it inside of another function as an argument, I don't store it as a variable, then that value just kind of goes into nothingness and it gets lost. So do keep that in mind. Now, another thing that you might want to look at if you look under the go further is what happens if we get invalid input? That's a great question. So inside my function, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an if statement. If radius is less than or equal to 0, I'm going to say return area of circle. Now notice I didn't pass the value in. And the default value is 3, so it's going to go and call that area of circle function itself. So it's calling itself, and that's something called recursion, and we're going to look at that example in the near future. If it is, so if my condition is false, this is going to be an else, and then I'm going to say, you know what? In that case, calculate my area based upon my radius, and then return it. So what does that mean? Well, let's just do a couple quick examples. And for simplicity's sake here, I'm going to have area of circle. I'm just going to print it. I'm going to print 2. I'm going to print -2. I'm going to leave a default 1. And I'm going to print -5. Now, if I run this, you'll notice that the bottom 3 all have the exact same value. Why? Because my radius was a negative number and said, nope, you can't have a negative value. So therefore, we're going to call and give it for the default value, which is what the third example is. And it's just a perfect example to show you that that's what's actually happening. Now, mathematically, remember, since radius is squared, a negative value squared generates a positive value. So would I have wanted to do that instead? Maybe. This is all dependent upon your use case. Are you protecting your user from potentially invalid code that may show up other places? So this is just a matter of how do we want to do it. But that's one way we could go a little bit further, use that default value when you return a function.